Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales. They say the prairie keeps its secrets. It buries them under layers of dust and time, until they're nothing more than whispers on the wind. But sometimes, a storm comes and washes the dust away, revealing a truth so sharp and unexpected it can cut a life in two. This is a story about a woman who thought she had buried her heart, only to have a ghost from her past stab her back into the light, bringing with him a storm of his own. Grief was a country, and for the past year, Alois Harper had been its sole inhabitant. Her small ranch, a lonely speck in the vast, sun-bleached plains of Colorado, was the capital. The borders were the horizons, endless and empty. The language was silence. She was a widow. The word itself was a hard, angular thing, a name she had never learned how to properly wear. A year ago, the town marshal, a kind man with sad eyes, had ridden out to her place with a hat in his hands and a story that had turned her world to ash. The stagecoach carrying her husband, Thomas, back from a trip to Denver had been ambushed by outlaws. It was a brutal, bloody affair. No survivors. They had found what was left of the passengers, and a wedding ring with the inscription "Always" had been pulled from the wreckage. Thomas was gone. Her Thomas. The steady, quiet man who had a laugh that could make the wildflowers grow and hands that were strong enough to build a house but gentle enough to hold a newborn calf. He was a memory now, a ghost who walked beside her as she did her chores, his absence a physical presence in the small, sturdy home they had built together. Alois was not a fragile woman. The prairie didn't allow for fragility. She was tall and strong, with her late husband's stubbornness and a resilience she hadn't known she possessed. She ran the ranch herself, with the help of a single, aging hired hand named Jeb, who lived in a small cabin a mile down the creek. She mended her own fences, branded her own cattle, and faced the crushing loneliness of the plains with a quiet and yielding grit. She was surviving. She had accepted that was all that was left for her. The night she found the man began with a sound. It was late, a moonless, star-dusted night. She was in her kitchen, cleaning up after a simple supper, when she heard it. A sound from the direction of the barn. It wasn't the familiar nicker of her horse or the rustle of a coyote. It was a low, pained groan, a human sound, quickly swallowed by the wind. Her first instinct was fear. A lone woman on an isolated ranch was a tempting target for the desperate men who drifted through these lands. Her hand went to the old shotgun she kept loaded and mounted on the wall by the back door. She stood by the door for a long time, listening. The only sound was the wind, a lonely, ceaseless whisper. Maybe she had imagined it. A trick of the wind, of a mind steeped in solitude. She was about to turn away when she heard it again. A definite thud, as if something heavy had fallen against the barn's inner wall. She was not imagining it. Her heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs. She took the shotgun from its pegs. Its weight was a solid, cold comfort in her hands. She slipped out the back door, moving with a practiced silence, keeping to the shadows. The barn was a large, dark silhouette against the star-filled sky. The main doors were barred from the outside, just as she had left them. She crept around to the side, to the smaller door she used for daily access. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of deeper blackness in the dark wall. Someone was inside. She raised the shotgun, her knuckles white. She pushed the door open with the barrel, the creak of the old hinges unnaturally loud in the tense silence. The air inside was thick with the familiar, comforting smell of hay and leather, but tonight it was laced with something else. The sharp, coppery scent of blood. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice a low, steady command that betrayed none of the fear she felt. "I've got a scattergun, and I know how to use it." There was no answer, only a soft, shuffling sound from the back, from the empty stall where she kept her winter feed. She cocked both hammers of the shotgun, the double click a definitive, deadly sound in the enclosed space. She lit the lantern she had brought, its yellow light pushing back the shadows, and advanced slowly into the barn. She saw him. He was slumped in the corner of the stall, half buried in the clean straw. He was a ruin of a man, dressed in tattered, blood-soaked clothes. One arm was bent at an unnatural angle, and a dark, ugly stain was spreading across his chest. He was breathing, but in shallow, ragged gasps. Her first thought was that he was a wounded outlaw, seeking refuge. Her finger tightened on the trigger, but then the lantern light fell fully on his face, and Alois Harper's world stopped turning. The man's face was covered in a rough, matted beard, and streaked with dirt and dried blood. But the face beneath it, the high cheekbones, the strong line of his jaw, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead. It was a face she knew better than her own. A face she saw every night in her dreams. A face she had mourned for a solid year. It was Thomas. The shotgun slipped from her numb fingers and clattered to the floor. A small, choked gasp, escaped her lips. It couldn't be. Thomas was dead, buried in a common grave 100 miles from here. This was a trick of the light, a phantom conjured by her own grief-addled mind. She took a step closer, her legs trembling. She raised the lantern. The light fell on his left hand, which was lying limp in the straw. On his ring finger was a simple, gold band, and on his temple, peeking out from under the matted hair, was a small, crescent-shaped scar, a souvenir from a childhood encounter with a runaway horse. A scar she had traced with her own fingers 1,000 times. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a trick. It was him. The shock was a physical blow, so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. A tidal wave of 100 conflicting emotions washed over her: disbelief, joy so intense it was agonizing, confusion, and a new, terrible fear. He was here, but he was broken, bleeding, and dying in her barn. She fell to her knees beside him, her mind a whirlwind. How? Why? The questions were a meaningless roar. All that mattered was the man on the ground, the impossible, miraculous man who was her husband. She reached out a trembling hand and touched his cheek. He was real. He was warm. He let out another low groan of pain, and his eyes, the same deep, forest green eyes she had fallen in love with, fluttered open. They were clouded with pain and delirium, and they did not seem to see her. They were looking at something far away, something terrible. "They know," he rasped, his voice a dry, broken whisper. "Jacob, they know." And then his eyes rolled back in his head, and he was still. Alois stared at him, his strange, nonsensical words echoing in the stunned silence of the barn. Jacob? Who was Jacob? Her husband, the man she had loved for 10 years, had just appeared from the dead, and the first thing he had spoken was another man's name. The initial, overwhelming shock began to recede, replaced by a cold, terrifying thought. This man looked like her husband. He had his scars, his ring. But was he? Or was this something else? A cruel joke of fate. A deception so monstrous it was almost unthinkable. The widow, stunned by the ghost in her barn, found herself facing a question that could tear her apart. Was this a resurrection, or the beginning of a whole new nightmare? The man in the barn was an anchor, dragging Eloise down into a sea of impossible questions. But he was also a drowning man, and her instincts, the deep, ingrained habits of a woman used to caring for life, took over. She could question the miracle later. First, she had to keep it from dying. Getting him from the barn to the house was a Herculean task. He was a dead weight, his body limp and unresponsive. She was a strong woman, but he was a large man. She used an old feed sack as a travois, and with a strength born of pure, desperate adrenaline, she dragged him, inch by painstaking inch, across the dusty yard and into her home. She laid him on her bed, the bed they had shared, the bed that had been a cold, empty continent of grief for the past year. Now, it held his impossible, broken body. The sight of him there, in their room, was so profoundly strange it made her head spin. She worked with a grim, focused efficiency, the rancher's wife who knew how to set a bone and stitch a wound. She lit every lantern in the house, pushing back the shadows, as if the light itself could ward off the unreality of the situation. She cut away his tattered, bloody shirt. The wound in his chest was a nasty, ragged tear, a bullet wound that had gouged a path along his ribs. It was deep, and it was infected. His left arm was clearly broken, the bone bent at a sickening angle. His body was a roadmap of abuse, covered in a latticework of bruises and cuts, both old and new. This was a man who had been through a private, brutal war. For hours, she worked. She cleaned the wound as best she could, pouring raw whiskey into it, an act of brutal but necessary mercy that made him cry out in his delirium. She stitched the torn flesh with a fine needle and silk thread, her seamstress's skills put to a grim new use. She set his broken arm, binding it tight with splints made from a broken chair rung. As she worked, she studied him, her mind a turmoil of hope and a terrible, creeping doubt. It was Thomas's face, no question. The familiar planes and angles were etched into her memory. But there were differences, small, and settling things. He was thinner than she had ever seen him, almost gone, the bones of his face sharp and pronounced. And there was a hardness around his eyes, even in his unconscious state, a tension that the gentle, easygoing man she had married had never possessed. She kept telling herself it was the suffering he had endured. A year of whatever hell he had been through would change any man. When she had done all she could for his wounds, she sat by his bedside, a shotgun across her lap, and waited. The sun rose, and she did not sleep. She just watched him, her mind replaying his first, delirious words, Jacob. They know. The name was a splinter in her mind. Thomas had no brother. He had been an only child, his parents lost to a fire when he was young. He had no family but her. Who was Jacob? The man drifted in and out of a fevered sleep. He would thrash and mutter, his words a broken, nonsensical stream. He spoke of a syndicate, of a ledger, of a place called Blackwood. They were words without context, fragments of a life she didn't recognize. He never once said her name. Doubt began to take root in the fertile soil of her confusion. Was this a trick? A cruel deception? The West was full of stories of grifters and con men, men who would use any means to get what they wanted. But what could anyone possibly want from her, a grieving widow on a small, isolated ranch? And how could they have possibly replicated the intimate details of her husband's body, like the crescent-shaped scar on his temple? The second day passed in a haze of wary vigilance. She forced broth between his lips. She kept his fever down with cold compresses. And she waited. On the evening of the second day, he woke. His eyes were clear, lucid for the first time. They focused on her, and a look of profound, heart-stopping recognition dawned in them. "Ellie," he whispered, using her private pet name, a name no one else in the world had ever called her. The sound of that name, in his voice, shattered her doubt. It was him. It had to be him. A wave of pure, unadulterated joy, so intense it was painful, washed over her. Tears she had thought long dried streamed down her face. "Thomas," she cried, her voice breaking. "Oh God, Thomas. I thought you were dead." She took his hand, the one that wasn't broken, and held it to her cheek. It was real. This was all real. A look of confusion passed over his face. "Dead," he murmured, his voice weak. "No, not dead. They left me." But his brow furrowed in a painful effort of memory. The coach. The ambush. There was a fire. His eyes grew distant, cloudy. I can't remember." "It's all right," she said, her voice soothing, though her own heart was pounding. "Don't try to remember now. Just rest. You're home. You're safe." But as he drifted back to sleep, a new, more terrible question began to form in her mind. If this was Thomas, her gentle, law-abiding husband, a man who worked as a freight agent, what kind of trouble had he been in that would result in an ambush, a fake death, and a year of brutal captivity? And who were the they who knew about Jacob? Over the next few days, as he began to slowly, painfully recover, the mystery only deepened. He had amnesia. Not a complete absence of memory, but a shattered, fragmented version of it. He knew her. He knew the house. He knew the name of his horse. But the last year, and the events leading up to the ambush, were a complete, terrifying blank. She would try to jog his memory, telling him stories of their life together. He would smile, a weak shadow of his old, familiar smile. But when she would ask him about his last trip to Denver, about the freight company he worked for, a shudder would come down in his eyes, a look of pained confusion. And there were other, unsettling discrepancies. One afternoon, as she was helping him shave, she noticed a new scar, a thin, white line tucked away under his jawline, that she had never seen before. When she asked him about it, he had no memory of how he had gotten it. Another time, he picked up a piece of leather and a tool from her sewing basket and, with an absent-minded, instinctive skill she had never seen him possess, began to fashion a complex, beautiful knot. Her Thomas had been clever, but he had never been that skilled with his hands. She was living with a ghost who was both her husband and a stranger. The man who wore his face and shared his memories seemed to possess a different set of skills, a different, harder nature that lurked just beneath the surface of his confusion. The hope that had been a brilliant, blinding sun was now clouded with a growing, terrifying unease. She had her husband back, but she was beginning to fear that the man who had returned from the dead had brought a whole host of new devils back with him. The days at the Harper Ranch took on a surreal, suspended quality. They were to people in a bubble of time, the world outside held at bay by the valley's isolating embrace. The man who was Thomas recovered his physical strength with a surprising speed. His body, though scarred and leaner than Eloise remembered, was resilient, accustomed to hardship. The broken arm began to mend, the deep gash in his chest slowly closed. But his mind remained a fractured landscape. He was a man living in a house of his own memories, but with no key to the most important rooms. He would walk the ranch with a proprietary air, his hand resting on a fence post he had set, yet he couldn't recall the year he had set it. He would call her Ollie with a familiar, easy affection, but he couldn't remember the last conversation they'd had before he left for Denver. Eloise lived on a knife's edge of hope and confusion. Every familiar gesture, every shared memory he did recall, was a balm to her soul, a confirmation that her husband had truly returned. But every gap in his memory, every strange new skill he displayed, was a fresh cut, a new seed of doubt. One morning, she came out of the house to find him in the corral with her horse, a spirited mare that had always been a little skittish. Thomas had been a competent rider, but never a true horseman. This man, however, moved with a quiet, innate confidence. He wasn't breaking the horse, he was conversing with it, his hands gentle, his voice a low, calming murmur. In minutes, he had the nervous animal standing still, its head lowered, nuzzling his hand. It was a mastery she had never seen in her husband. "You're good with horses," she said, her voice betraying a hint of her surprise. He looked up, a flicker of something pride, confusion in his eyes. "I guess so," he said. "Feels natural." Another piece of the puzzle that didn't fit. The biggest mystery remained the name he had spoken that first night. Jacob. She had tried to ask him about it, but the name drew a complete blank. He would just stare at her, a pained, frustrated look on his face, as if the name was a word in a language he had forgotten. She decided to search for her own answers. One afternoon, while he was sleeping, she went through the pockets of the tattered clothes he had been wearing when he arrived. They were caked with dirt and blood, and she found little of use. An empty shell casing, a tarnished silver button, but in a small, hidden pocket sewn into the lining of his coat, she found something else. It was a small, folded piece of oilcloth. Inside was a photograph. A tintype, old and worn, its corners soft with handling. It was a picture of two young men, almost boys, standing side by side. They were identical. The same dark hair, the same strong jaw, the same deep-set eyes. One of them was undeniably her Thomas, a younger, more carefree version of the man she had married. The other was his exact mirror image. Eloise stared at the photograph, her blood turning to ice. A twin. Thomas had never, in the 10 years they had been together, mentioned a twin brother. He had always told her he was an only child, his family gone. The lie, so profound, so absolute, shook the very foundations of her world. Why would he have kept such a secret from her? She looked at the man sleeping in her bed, at the face she loved, and saw him, for the first time, as a complete stranger. The small discrepancies, the forgotten memories, the new skills, they all suddenly coalesced into a single, terrifying possibility. Was it possible? Could the man in her bed not be her husband at all? Could he be this other man, this secret brother? The thought was madness. But the photograph in her hand was undeniable proof of a deep, long-held deception. She confronted him that evening. She waited until they had finished their quiet supper. She placed the tintype on the table between them. "Who is this Thomas?" she asked, her voice quiet, but trembling with a storm of emotion. He picked up the photograph. He stared at it for a long, long time. His brow was furrowed, his eyes filled with a desperate, struggling concentration. I don't know," he said, his voice a strained whisper. But as he looked at the faces, a flicker of memory, of emotion, crossed his own. "He feels familiar." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a desperate plea. "Ellie, I'm trying to remember. I swear I am. But it's all fog." Her heart broke for him, for the man struggling to reclaim his own mind. But her own heart was breaking for a different reason. The doubt was no longer a seed, it was a thorny, strangling vine. His name is Jacob, she said, her voice flat, testing the name on him, watching for a reaction. The name hit him like a physical blow. He flinched, his hand going to his head as if in pain. A low groan escaped his lips. Jacob, he repeated, the name a strange and painful sound. He looked at the photograph again, at the two identical faces. Am I Thomas? Or am I Jacob? The question hung in the air between them, a terrifying, unanswerable thing. The man she had rescued, the man she was caring for, the man she was beginning to love all over again, didn't even know who he was. Eloise felt a wave of dizziness. She had found her husband, only to lose him again in a fog of amnesia and lies. And she was beginning to fear that the truth, if it ever came, would be more devastating than the year of grief she had already endured. The stranger in her home was not just a man with a shattered memory, he was a man with a shattered identity, and she was trapped in the wreckage with him. The discovery of the photograph and the name Jacob created a deep, silent fracture in the fragile world Eloise and the stranger were building. He was still the man who wore her husband's face, but now he was also the man who carried his twin's ghost. The question of his identity hung over every shared meal, every quiet conversation. He called himself Thomas, because that was the life she had presented to him, but the uncertainty was a constant, and spoken presence in his eyes. Eloise was torn. Part of her wanted to believe he was Thomas, that the brother was a secret her husband had kept for some unknown, painful reason. But another, more rational part of her knew that the discrepancies, the strange new skills, the gaping holes in his memory, all pointed to a more devastating truth. She was living with a doppelganger, a man who was both an intimate connection to her past and a terrifying symbol of her loss. The outside world, which they had managed to keep at bay, began to intrude. Their supplies were running low. The attack and the fire at the barn had destroyed much of her winter stores. Eloise knew she had to go to town. The thought filled her with a new kind of dread. Chapel Creek was a place of memory, of pitying looks and whispered condolences. To go there now, with this impossible secret in her heart, felt like a betrayal. But it was necessary. She decided to leave the stranger at the ranch. He was strong enough to be on his own for a day, and the risk of bringing him to town, of someone noticing the impossible resemblance, was too great. I'll be back by sundown, she told him. He was sitting on the porch, staring out at the plains, a lost, haunted look on his face. There's a rifle by the door. Use it if you have to. He just nodded, his mind seemingly miles away. The ride to Chapel Creek was a lonely one. The town, when she arrived, was just as she had left it, a dusty, sleepy collection of buildings under a vast, empty sky. But it felt different to her now. It felt like a place of lies. Her first stop was the general store. The proprietor, Mr. Abernathy, a kind but gossipy man, greeted her with his usual sad-eyed sympathy. Eloise, he said, his voice hushed. Good to see you. How are you holding up? I'm managing, Silas, she said, forcing a smile that felt brittle. Heard you had some trouble out at your place, he said, lowering his voice. Jeb was in here last week. Said you had a fire. Lost the old barn. The news had traveled. Of course it had. An accident, she said, the light tasting like ash. A stray lantern. He nodded, but his eyes were full of a gentle suspicion. And Jeb? He said he hasn't seen you much. Said you've been keeping to yourself even more than usual. Just been busy with the repairs, she said, quickly gathering her Supplesfleur coffee salt, and, on a sudden impulse, a box of .40 cartridges for Thomas's old rifle. Her last stop was the marshal's office. She needed to file a report about the fire, to keep up the pretense of normalcy. Marshal Davis was the same man who had brought her the news of Thomas's death. He was a good man, but a tired one, overwhelmed by the casual lawlessness of the territory. He listened to her story about the accidental fire with a weary patience. I'll ride out in a few days, take a look, he said, though they both knew it was a formality. You be careful out there alone, Eloise. These are hard times. As she was about to leave, her eyes fell upon a wanted poster nailed to the wall. It was new, the paper still crisp. The drawing was a crude but effective sketch of a man with cold, hard eyes and a cruel slash of a mouth. The name under it was Silas Kane. The reward was a staggering $5,000. The crimes listed were a litany of violence, robbery, murder, and conspiracy against the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. The name Pinkerton sent a strange jolt through her. Thomas, in his work as a freight agent, had sometimes coordinated with the Pinkertons on high-value shipments. He had spoken of them with a grudging respect. She was about to turn away when she read the fine print at the bottom. The poster was issued by the Pinkerton office in Denver, and it listed Kane's known associates. The names were a blur, until her eyes landed on one. A name that made the blood freeze in her veins. Jacob Harper. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. She stared at the name, her heart hammering against her ribs. Jacob Harper. Her husband's name. But it couldn't be. It had to be a coincidence. But the name, combined with the photograph, with the man in her bed, it was too much to be a coincidence. Something wrong, Eloise? The marshal asked, noticing her pale face. No, she whispered, her voice a dry crackle. No, nothing. She fled from the office, her mind a chaotic storm. Jacob Harper, an associate of a wanted killer, a man involved in a conspiracy against the Pinkertons. She rode back to the ranch in a daze, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place, forming a picture that was more terrible than anything she could have imagined. The man in her house was not her husband. He couldn't be. Her Thomas was a gentle, law-abiding man. He was not an outlaw, an associate of a man like Silas Kane. The man in her house was Jacob, the secret twin, the outlaw. The hope that she had so desperately clung to was a lie. The miracle was a deception. She had been caring for, tending to, and, she admitted to herself with a sickening lurch, beginning to fall in love with a stranger. A dangerous stranger, who had brought a world of violence and lies into her home. She arrived back at the ranch as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of blood and bruises. She found him on the porch, just where she had left him, still staring out at the horizon. She walked up the steps, her face a mask of cold, hard resolve. She had to know the truth. All of it. She stood before him, the wanted poster, which she had torn from the wall of the marshal's office, clutched in her hand. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice no longer the gentle, caring tone of a wife, but the sharp, cutting edge of a woman betrayed. "Who are you, really?" She threw the wanted poster at his feet. He looked down at it, at the name of Silas Kane, and then at the name below it. His name, Jacob Harper. He looked at it, and as he did, a new light dawned in his eyes. Not a light of confusion. It was a light of pure, unadulterated memory. The fog had finally, terribly, lifted. He looked up at her, and the face was Thomas's, but the eyes were those of a stranger, filled with a world of pain, guilt, and a past that was about to come crashing down on them both. The name on the wanted poster was a key, unlocking a door in the man's mind that had been rusted shut. The fog of amnesia did not recede gently. It was ripped away, leaving behind the raw, jagged landscape of his true memory. He looked up at Eloise, and the pained confusion was gone, replaced by an expression of such profound, agonizing clarity that it took her breath away. "Jacob," he said, the name a statement, not a question. His voice was different. The soft, hesitant tone was gone, replaced by a rougher, harder edge. "My name is Jacob." The confession, simple and absolute, hit Eloise with the force of a physical blow. She had known it, deep down, but to hear him say it, to have the last, desperate flicker of hope extinguished, was devastating. She staggered back a step, her hand going to her mouth to stifle a cry that was a mixture of grief and a terrible, chilling rage. "You lied to me," she whispered, the words trembling. "No," he said, getting slowly to his feet. He was no longer the weak, dependent patient. He was a different man, a man who moved with a coiled, dangerous energy. "I didn't lie. I didn't remember." He looked at the poster, then back at her, and his eyes were filled with a terrible, weary sadness. "God help me, I wish I still didn't." He was Jacob Harper, and the story he told her, as the shadows lengthened and the prairie grew dark, was a story of two brothers, of loyalty and betrayal, and of a life lived in the margins of the law. He and Thomas were twins, inseparable as boys. But as they grew, their paths had diverged. Thomas was the steady one, the builder, the man who craved a home and a family. Jacob was the restless one, the drifter, the man with a fast gun and a penchant for finding trouble. He had fallen in with a bad crowd, had lived a life on the edge of the outlaw world. Thomas had never given up on him. He had tried to pull him out, had sent him money, had always been there to clean up his messes. And that, Jacob explained, his voice thick with a guilt that was almost suffocating, was what had gotten Thomas killed. Thomas had not been a simple freight agent. That had been a cover. For the last 5 years of his life, Thomas Harper had been an undercover agent for the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. His target was the Blackwood Syndicate, a powerful, ruthless criminal organization run by Silas Kane. The syndicate controlled smuggling routes, ran protection rackets, and had a network of corrupt officials that reached all the way to Denver. Thomas had been on the verge of bringing them down. He had compiled a ledger, a detailed account of their operations, with enough evidence to destroy them. He was bringing it back with him on that final stagecoach journey. He asked for my help, Jacob said, his voice a low, pained rasp. He knew the syndicate had found out about him. He knew they would try to hit the stage. He wanted me to be his backup, his ghost in the rocks. I was supposed to watch his back. Jacob had been there. He had watched from a distance as the ambush happened. But it had been a setup, bigger and more brutal than they had anticipated. There were too many of them. I tried to get to him, Jacob said, his eyes haunted by the memory. I was too late. They killed everyone. They shot him, Allie. And they took the ledger. He looked at his own scarred hands. I killed 3 of them before they got me. They left me for dead, right beside him. The story was a brutal, devastating revelation. The ambush had not been a random act of violence. It had been a targeted assassination. And her husband had been a hero, a man fighting a secret war she had known nothing about. But why, she asked, her mind reeling. Why the secret? Why did he never tell me about you? To protect you, Jacob said simply. My life. It was a dangerous one. To be associated with me was to be a target. He kept us separate to keep you safe. He built this life with you, this peaceful, honest life, and he didn't want my shadow falling over it. The lie that had so wounded her was, in fact, an act of profound, protective love. The knowledge was both a comfort and a new, sharper kind of pain. And you, she asked, how did you survive? I don't know, he admitted. I woke up in a ditch miles away, with a hole in my side and my head full of thunder. A prospector found me, patched me up, but my memory, it was gone. All I had was a name that haunted me, Jacob, and a vague, instinctual feeling that I was being hunted. I've been drifting ever since, a ghost, until I saw this place. And something felt like home. He had been drawn there by a phantom memory, a subconscious pull towards the one place on earth his brother had loved. Eloise sank into a chair, the weight of the truth crushing her. Her husband was truly, definitively dead. The man before her was his brother, a man who had lived a life of violence, a man who was now a loose end in the syndicate's bloody accounting. The man in her barn was no longer a mystery. He was a liability, a danger. His presence here was a death sentence, for both of them. They know, she whispered, remembering his first, delirious words. What did you mean? They know, Jacob. I knew. Cold dread entered his eyes. Before it all went black, he said, one of them stood over me. It was Kane himself. He looked at me, lying next to Thomas, and he smiled. He said, well, look at that. 2 for the price of 1. He thought he had killed us both. But if they know I'm alive, they know I was there. They know I can identify them. They will come to finish the job. The sound in the barn had not been the arrival of a miracle. It had been the arrival of a war. And her small, quiet ranch was about to become the battlefield. Jacob looked at her, his face a mask of grim resolve. The drifter, the man without a past, now had one. And it was his brother's. I'm sorry, Ellie, he said, his voice rough. I've brought hell to your doorstep. He stood up and walked to the door, looking out at the dark, silent prairie. I'll leave at dawn. I'll draw them away from you. Eloise looked at him, at the last living piece of her husband, a man who was willing to ride out and face a criminal army alone to protect her. She thought of the promise she had made to herself, to be strong, to survive. But survival was not enough. She thought of her Thomas, of the brave, secret life he had led. And she knew what he would want her to do. He would not want her to hide. He would want her to fight. No, she said, her voice quiet but firm, pulling his attention back to her. She stood up and walked to the wall where her own shotgun and Thomas's old rifle were mounted. "You're not leaving," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound, absolute authority. "They took my husband. They destroyed my life. They are not going to take my home." She took the rifle from the wall and held it out to him. "You said my husband was a hero. It's time we started acting like it." Her grief had been a private, passive thing. Now, it had been forged into a weapon. The unveiling was complete. She was no longer just a widow. She was the keeper of her husband's legacy, and she was ready to go to war for it. Jacob stared at the rifle Eloise was holding out to him, and then at her face. He saw not a grieving widow, but a woman of terrifying resolve. The same stubborn and yielding fire he had seen in his brother was now burning in her eyes. In his entire, rough life, he had never been the one to be protected. He had always been the one to cause the trouble, the one to run from it. The idea of this woman, his brother's wife, standing with him against the syndicate was both deeply humbling and profoundly unsettling. "Ellie, you don't know what you're saying," he said, his voice a low growl. "These men, Silas Kane, they are not common outlaws. They are an army. They will burn this place to the ground with us in it." "They've already burned my life to the ground once," she retorted, her voice as sharp and unyielding as flint. "I will not let them do it again." She pushed the rifle into his hands. "You owe him this, Jacob. We both do. We fight." There was no arguing with her. The decision was made. The quiet ranch that had been a sanctuary of grief was now a fortress, the front line in a war they were hopelessly outnumbered in. The immediate, cold reality of their situation settled over them. They were two people, with 2 rifles, 1 shotgun, and limited ammunition, against a criminal syndicate with dozens of men and limitless resources. "All right," Jacob said, the word a reluctant surrender to her will. The moment he accepted the rifle, the shift in him was palpable. The lost, amnesiac drifter was gone, replaced by a man who understood the grim calculus of violence. The skills he had tried to forget, the instincts he had suppressed, came flooding back. "If we're going to do this, we're going to do it my way. They'll come. We just don't know when. We need to be ready." For the next week, the Harper Ranch was transformed. Under Jacob's direction, it became a meticulously prepared death trap. He was a natural tactician, his mind able to see the landscape not as a ranch, but as a battlefield. "The house is a coffin," he declared on the first day. "Too many windows, too many doors. We can't defend it. We use the land." He and Eloise worked from sunup to sundown. They dug a series of trenches and foxholes in the hills overlooking the main house, positions that would give them clear fields of fire while keeping them concealed. They felled trees to create barricades on the main trail leading to the ranch, designed not to stop an army, but to slow them down, to funnel them into a predetermined kill zone. Eloise, for her part, was not a passive observer. She was a soldier. She had a deep, intimate knowledge of the land, of its hidden ravines and secret game trails. She showed Jacob a series of small caves in the bluffs behind the house, perfect for storing their meager supplies of water and ammunition, and for a final, desperate fallback position. As they worked, a new dynamic formed between them. They were not husband and wife. They were not strangers. They were comrades, their shared purpose a powerful, unspoken bond. He was the strategist, the man of violence. She was the anchor, the woman of unyielding will, the reason for the fight. He found himself looking at her with a no, grudging respect. She was not the soft, gentle woman his brother had described in his letters. She was a force of nature, as tough and resilient as the prairie itself. One evening, as they shared a simple meal in one of their new defensive positions, he finally asked the question that had been haunting him. "Why are you doing this, Allie?" he asked, his voice quiet. "You could have run. You still can. I could draw them off." She looked at him, her green eyes reflecting the flickering firelight. "Because for the last year, I have done nothing but run, in my own mind. I have been a victim. I will not be a victim anymore. This is my home. He died for it. I will not surrender it." She looked at him, her gaze direct. "And because you look like him, and I will not watch him die a second time." Her words were a comfort and a terrible burden. He was a living reminder of her greatest love and her deepest loss. He was her reason to fight, and a constant, painful echo of the past. The waiting was the hardest part. Every day that passed was another day of tense, nerve-wracking silence. They would watch the horizon, expecting to see the dust cloud of an approaching army. The waiting stretched for a week, then two. Maybe they don't know, Heloise said one afternoon, a flicker of hope in her voice. Maybe they think you're dead. No, Jacob said grimly. A man like Cain doesn't leave loose ends. He's not coming with an army. Not yet. He's cautious. A whisper before the storm. He was right. The first sign of trouble came not as a thundering of hooves, but as a single, lone rider, spotted late one afternoon at the edge of their valley. He was not a cowboy. He rode with a military precision, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain. He was a professional, a scout. Jacob and Eloise watched him from their hidden perch in the hills, their rifles ready. The scout was good. He made his way into the valley, his path a careful, zigzagging route, clearly looking for signs of life. He rode up to the ranch house. He circled it, his pistol in his hand. He saw the signs of their preparations: fresh-cut timber, the new earth of the trenches. He knew someone was here, and they were prepared for a fight. "Don't shoot," Jacob whispered to Eloise, who had the man in her sights. "We can't let him report back. We have to take him alive." The scout, his mission complete, turned his horse to leave the valley. But he didn't ride back the way he came. He took a different, more direct route out. A route that would take him right past a narrow, rocky defile where Jacob and Eloise had prepared their first surprise. It was a simple tripwire, connected to a heavy, dead log, positioned on the slope above the trail. It was a trap designed not to kill, but to incapacitate. They raced to get into position, a silent, desperate scramble through the rocks. They got there just as the scout was entering the defile. He never saw the wire. His horse's front legs caught it, and the log came crashing down. It didn't hit the man, but it struck the horse, a brutal, crushing blow. The animal screamed and went down, pinning the scout's leg beneath its heavy body. The man lay there, trapped and screaming in pain and rage. Jacob and Eloise emerged from the rocks, their rifles leveled at him. The scout stopped screaming and stared at them, his eyes wide with surprise and a dawning horror. "Looks like you've had an accident," Jacob said, his voice as cold and hard as the rocks around them. They had drawn their line in the dust. They had captured the first of their enemies. But they both knew that all they had done was announce their presence. The whisper was over. The storm was now, officially, on its way. The captured scout was a man named Corrigan, a former army sergeant with cold, calculating eyes and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. Even with his leg crushed under his dead horse, he radiated an air of professional, detached menace. He was not a common thug, he was a soldier, and he knew the rules of the game he was playing. "You're making a mistake," he grunted as Jacob and Eloise approached, the pain in his leg causing beads of sweat to form on his brow. "Cain will find you, and when he does, he'll make what you do to me look like a Sunday picnic." "He has to find us first," Jacob said, his voice flat. He used his knife to cut the saddlebags from the dead horse while Eloise kept her rifle trained on Corrigan. "And you're going to help us make sure that takes a long, long time." They managed to free Corrigan from under the horse, a grueling, painful process. His leg was badly broken, a shard of bone protruding from the skin. He didn't cry out, but his face was pale with shock and agony. They made a crude splint for his leg and, using his own horse's reins, bound his hands tightly. They took him not to the house, but to one of the hidden caves in the bluffs. It was a small, dry, and easily defensible position. Here, with their prisoner secured, the interrogation began. Jacob was the interrogator. He was not physically cruel. He had seen enough of that in his life. He used a more potent combination of psychological pressure and cold, inescapable logic. He laid out the contents of Corrigan's own saddlebags, a detailed map of the territory with the Harper Ranch circled, a coded list of names, and a letter of instruction from Silas Cain. "We know who you are," Jacob said, his voice a low, even monotone that was more unnerving than any shout. "We know who you work for, and we know they're coming. You have two choices. You can tell us what we need to know: how many men, when they're coming, what their plan is, and you might live. Or, you can be a loyal soldier, and we'll leave you here for the coyotes. Your leg is broken. You won't last a day. Corrigan was a hard man, but he was also a pragmatist. He looked from Jacob's cold, merciless eyes to Eloise's steady and wavering rifle, and he made his choice. He talked. He told them everything. Cain had an army of 30 men, all well-armed, all veterans of the war or other, darker conflicts. They were based in a hidden fortress town on the other side of the border. And they weren't just coming to kill Jacob and Eloise. They were coming to take the ranch. The ledger, Corrigan explained, his voice a low growl of pain. Your brother's book. Cain doesn't know where it is, but he knows it exists. He believes your brother hid it somewhere on this ranch. He's not just coming to silence you. He's coming to tear this place apart, stone by stone, until he finds it. The revelation was a chilling one. They were not just protecting their lives, they were protecting the legacy of Thomas's final, heroic act. When are they coming? Eloise asked, her voice tight. Soon, Corrigan said. He was waiting for my signal. When I didn't report back by tomorrow morning, he would know something was wrong. He'll send a larger party, and then the rest of them will follow. They had less than 24 hours. That night, as Jacob stood guard at the mouth of the cave and Eloise tended to their prisoner's wounds, an act of compassion that seemed to deeply confuse the hardened mercenary, they had to make a decision. We can't win, Jacob said, his voice grim. Not against 30 men. Our best bet is to take the ledger and run. Use the information to bring the law down on them. No, Eloise said, her voice firm. We saw how the law works in Chapel Creek. By the time they act, Cain will have what he wants, and we will be dead. We have to make our stand here. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a desperate, brilliant light. We can't win in a fair fight. So, we won't fight fair. A new, audacious plan began to form, born of her intimate knowledge of the land and his cold, tactical mind. They would not just defend. They would attack. They would use the syndicate's own numbers and arrogance against them. Their plan had 3 parts. The first involved their prisoner. You're going to send your signal, Jacob told Corrigan the next morning. He had found the scout's signaling mirror in his saddlebags. You're going to signal that the ranch is clear, that you found the grave of the man they're looking for. You're going to tell them that the woman is alone, a grieving, helpless widow. They'll know it's a trap, Corrigan sneered. Maybe, Eloise said, stepping forward. But Cain is an arrogant man. He believes women are weak. The idea of a helpless widow, alone on a valuable piece of land. It will be too tempting for him to resist. He won't send his whole army. He'll send a smaller party first, to secure the prize. And that's when we'll hit them. It was a brilliant piece of psychological manipulation, using the enemy's own prejudices against them. Under duress, Corrigan sent the signal. Now, for the second part of their plan. They knew the first party would come up the main trail. They spent the rest of the day preparing their main ambush, not at the house, but in the narrow canyon pass where Wes had first disabled the rustler's wagon so many weeks ago in another life. They used the last of their dynamite, not to create a rock slide, but to strategically weaken the canyon walls, turning the entire pass into a massive, deadly trap. The third part was the most dangerous. It involved separating themselves. They will send a small group, maybe 5 or 6 men, Jacob reasoned. While I deal with them in the pass, you, Ellie, have another job. A more important one. He spread out Corrigan's map. This is their main camp. Corrigan marked it. While Cain's attention is on the party he sends here, the camp will be lightly guarded. You are going to go there. To do what? She asked, her heart pounding at the thought of it. To start a fire, he said, a cold, grim smile on his face. Not a big one. A symbolic one. You are going to get to their horses. You are going to set them free. And you are going to leave a message. You're going to take this. He handed her a small, star-shaped badge. It was a Pinkerton badge. His brother's. You're going to leave this on Cain's own pillow. You are going to let him know that this is not just about a rancher and a drifter. This is about the Pinkerton Agency. You're going to put the fear of God, and the fear of a much larger enemy, into him. It was a plan of incredible, almost suicidal, bravery. It meant they would be separated, each fighting their own battle, their survival dependent on the other's success. It was the ultimate test of their new partnership. As dusk fell, they stood at the edge of the valley, ready to put their desperate plan into motion. They could see the dust cloud of the first party of Cain's men approaching in the distance. Be safe, Jacob, Eloise said, her voice a soft whisper. "You too, Ellie," he replied. He turned and headed for the canyon pass, a lone defender against an approaching army. She turned and mounted her horse, heading in the opposite direction, a lone ghost riding towards the heart of the enemy's lair. The interrogation was over. The battle for their future was about to begin on two separate fronts. Eloise rode through the twilight, a solitary figure in a vast, hostile landscape. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like an approaching rider. The fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but she pushed it down. She was no longer the grieving widow or the helpless prisoner. She was a soldier on a mission, and the thought of the man waiting in the canyon pass, trusting her to do her part, was a powerful, steadying force. She followed the directions from Corrigan's map, her natural sense of direction guiding her through the broken, unfamiliar country. The Syndicate's camp was 20 miles away, a hard, all-night ride. She pushed her horse, her mind a focused, calculated machine. Meanwhile, in the canyon pass, Jacob was a creature of the shadows, the ghost preparing his own deadly welcome. He had taken his position high in the rocks, overlooking the narrow trail. The trap was set. He had placed the dynamite charges, linked by a single, long fuse, at the weakest points of the canyon walls. He had only one rifle, one pistol, and a cold, grim determination. Just after dusk, they came. 6 of them, riding with a lazy confidence, just as Eloise had predicted. They were the advance party, the hyenas sent in to scout the kill. They saw the ranch house in the distance, dark and silent. They saw no sign of a trap. They rode into the pass, their voices echoing in the quiet air. Jacob waited. He let them get to the very center of the pass, to the point of no return. Then, he lit the fuse. It hissed for a terrifying second, a fiery snake in the darkness. Then, the world exploded. The dynamite didn't just create a rock slide, it shattered the very foundations of the canyon walls. With a deafening, grinding roar, both sides of the pass collapsed inward, a tidal wave of rock and earth. The 6 riders and their horses were not just trapped, they were buried. Jacob did not wait to survey his handiwork. The explosion would be a beacon, a signal to the main body of Kane's army that the trap had been sprung. He had bought them time, but he knew it would not be long before hell itself descended on this valley. He scrambled down from the rocks and ran, not back to the ranch, but to the rendezvous point he and Eloise had agreed upon, a series of hidden caves in the bluffs. His part was done. Now, all he could do was wait, and pray that she had succeeded in hers. Miles away, Eloise saw the faint, distant flash of the explosion, followed, a long time later, by the low, rumbling boom that rolled across the plains. She knew what it meant. Jacob had sprung the trap, and he was now alone, waiting. She urged her horse on, and knew, desperate urgency in her heart. She reached the perimeter of the Syndicate's camp just before dawn. It was a much larger and more formidable place than she had imagined. It was a small, fortified town, with a dozen rough-hewn buildings, a saloon, and a large, central corral holding at least 100 horses. There were men everywhere, even at this early hour. Her plan to simply sneak in and free the horses was impossible. She would be seen in seconds. She retreated into the hills, her mind racing. She had to create a diversion, something to draw the guards away from the corral. She remembered the hay barn at her own ranch, the fire that had been the beginning of her escape. The Syndicate had a massive hay barn too, at the edge of their camp. It was a desperate, dangerous idea, but it was the only one she had. She found a patch of dry grass upwind from the barn. She took out her flint and steel. Her hands were trembling, but she forced them to be steady. She struck a spark. A small flame flickered to life. She fed it, carefully, until it grew into a small but determined fire. The wind did the rest, carrying the sparks and embers towards the dry, waiting hay. It took 10 minutes. Then, the barn erupted in a sheet of flame. Just as at her own ranch, the camp exploded into chaos. Men shouted, bells rang, and everyone ran towards the fire. The corral, for a few precious moments, was left almost completely unguarded. This was her chance. She ran from the hills, a small, determined shadow. She reached the corral, pulled back the heavy wooden gate, and fired her pistol into the air. The horses, already spooked by the fire, bolted, a thundering, unstoppable stampede of horseflesh, scattering in every direction into the surrounding wilderness. She had crippled them. An army without horses was an army that was going nowhere. Now, for the final, most dangerous part of her mission. The message. She ran, not away from the camp, but into it, towards the largest building, the one that was clearly Cain's headquarters. The chaos of the fire was her cover. No one was paying attention to a small, lone figure running through the shadows. She found his room. It was opulent in a crude, brutal way, filled with expensive furniture and animal skins. On a large and made bed, she placed the small, star-shaped Pinkerton badge. It gleamed in the flickering light from the fire outside, a small, potent symbol of a much larger, more powerful enemy. She had done it. She had planted her own spark in the heart of their darkness. She slipped out of the building and disappeared back into the hills as the first light of dawn began to break. Her part was done. Now, all she had to do was make the long, dangerous ride back to Jacob, and pray that he was still alive. Silas Cain stood amidst the chaos of his burning, horseless camp, a cold, terrible understanding dawning in his eyes. He had been played. The scout, the ambush, the fire, the stampedite was all a coordinated, brilliant attack. This was not the work of a single, vengeful drifter. This was an organized, intelligent enemy. And the Pinkerton badge, which had been found on his pillow, was the final, chilling piece of the puzzle. He was not just fighting a ghost from his past. He was fighting the full, formidable weight of the agency his victim had worked for. His rage was monumental, but it was a cold, focused rage. He gathered his remaining men, a force of 24 hardened killers, now afoot and furious. "They think they've crippled us," he snarled, his voice a low, menacing growl. "They think we're trapped. They're wrong. We are not the hunted anymore. We are the hounds of hell, and we will run them to ground, on foot if we have to. We will find them, and we will tear them apart, piece by piece." The hunt began. It was a brutal, relentless affair. Cain's men, fueled by rage and a desire for revenge, were formidable trackers. They fanned out, a human net, sweeping through the Badlands. In their cave hideout, Jacob and Eloise knew their time was running out. They could hear the distant sounds of the search parties, the shouts of men echoing in the canyons. "They're coming," Jacob said, his face grim. "We can't stay here. We have to move." "Where can we go?" Eloise asked. "They are everywhere." "There is one place," Jacob said, a desperate, final plan forming in his mind. "A place they will never expect us to go. We go back. We go back to your ranch." It was a mad idea. To return to the very place they would be looking for them. "They will have left a guard there," Eloise argued. "A trap." "Exactly," Jacob said, a cold, dangerous light in his eyes. "And we are going to spring it. We're done running. We're done hiding. We're going to finish this, on our own terms, on our own ground." They traveled through the night, using secret, forgotten game trails that only Eloise knew. They arrived back at their valley just before dawn, to ghosts returning to their own haunted ground. As Jacob had predicted, Cain had left a guard. 4 of them, camped out in the ruins of the main house, confident that their prey was miles away. Jacob and Eloise did not attack them head-on. They used the dawn and the land as their weapons. They separated, coming at the camp from 2 different directions. The battle for the Harper Ranch was short, brutal, and decisive. It was not a battle of tactics, it was a battle of pure, desperate survival. When the sun rose, 4 more of Cain's men lay dead in the valley, and Jacob and Eloise stood, exhausted and bloody, but victorious. They had reclaimed their home, but they knew the real army was still coming. The 4 men they had killed were just the vanguard. Cain and his remaining 20 men would be here soon. They used their last precious hours to prepare for the final siege. They did not fortify the house. They fortified the land itself. They took their positions in the trenches and foxholes they had dug, overlooking the narrow trail that was the only entrance to their valley. This was their Thermopylae, their Alamo. This was the place they would make their final stand. They arrived in the afternoon. A force of 20 men, moving on foot, their faces grim and set. They were an army, and they were here to lay siege. The battle that followed was the stuff of legend. It was 2 people against 20, but it was 2 people fighting on their own ground, for their own lives, for their own future. Jacob was a master gunman, his shots from the trenches precise and deadly. Eloise was not a gunslinger, but she was a survivor. She reloaded the rifles, she brought him water, and her own shotgun spoke with a fierce, defiant roar whenever an enemy got too close. The battle raged for hours. The valley filled with the smoke and thunder of gunfire. Then fell. The odds began to even. But still they came on, driven by Cain's relentless will. The climax came as the sun began to set. Cain, in a final, desperate charge, led his remaining 10 men in a frontal assault on their main position. It was a suicidal, glorious, and terrible thing. Jacob and Eloise stood their ground, their rifles hot, their ammunition running low. They fought side by side, a man who had forgotten how to live and a woman who had forgotten how to die. In the final, bloody moments, Silas Cain himself broke through their line, his face a mask of hate, a knife in his hand. He lunged for Eloise. Jacob met his charge. The two men went down, a desperate, grunting struggle in the dirt and the blood. The fight was no longer about guns or tactics. It was about two men, and the woman who stood as the soul of their conflict. As they struggled, Eloise picked up a heavy rock. The man who had been her brother's killer, the man who had been the architect of all their pain, was about to kill the last person she had in the world. She brought the rock down, a single, brutal, and definitive blow. The battle was over. The silence that fell over the valley was a profound and holy thing. It was the silence of the end of a war. The last of Cain's men, seeing their leader fall, had broken and fled, disappearing back into the wilderness from which they had come. Jacob and Eloise stood in the midst of the carnage, two exhausted survivors in a valley of the dead. They were bruised, bleeding, and utterly, completely, spent. But they were alive. And they were free. They buried the dead, friend and foe alike, in a single, common grave. It was a grim, silent task that took them 2 days. As they shoveled the last of the dirt, and no quiet peace began to settle over them. The ghosts of the past had finally been laid to rest. In the weeks that followed, they began the slow, painful process of healing. Their physical wounds mended, but the deeper wounds, the scars on their souls, would take longer. They found the ledger, still safe in the cave where they had hidden it. It was their inheritance. A book of evil that could, in the right hands, become a tool for justice. They made a decision. They would not stay in the valley. It was a place of too many ghosts, too much blood. They would honor Thomas's legacy, not by hiding from the world, but by changing it. They rode to Santa Fe, two quiet, unassuming figures. They turned the ledger over to the Pinkerton agency. The information it contained was a bombshell. It led to the indictment and eventual downfall of a dozen corrupt officials, the dismantling of a vast criminal network. Thomas Harper's final report had been delivered. His war was finally won. With the reward money they received, a small fortune if he did not buy another ranch. They established a trust, an inheritance for the widows and orphans of men like Thomas, the lawmen and agents who had fallen in the line of duty. It was a legacy of hope, born from their own personal tragedy. And what of Jacob and Eloise? They did not marry. The ghost of Thomas stood, lovingly and respectfully, between them. They were not husband and wife. They were something else. They were partners, comrades, survivors. They rode away from Santa Fe, not as fugitives, and not as heroes, but as two free people. They didn't know where they were going. They were just riding, a man who had found his soul and a woman who had found her strength, heading towards a new sunrise, and a future they would build together, one quiet, peaceful day at a time. The storm was over. The land was quiet, and for the first time, it was truly their own.